techies, the roadies, the production companies, the venues. And they're used to accommodating a certain degree of uncertainty. But when the economy stops, it's not really the same kind of, it's not the same situation where you're reimagining how you're going to recover from this when you can't put any kind of time frame on that recovery.
Peter Elliott, I suppose you can relate to this. It's so much harder for musicians themselves. Like, I mean, Paul McClaney, for example, has put out his album Inheritance, and he's about to do a release live in the ASB Waterfront Theatre. You know, beautiful idea, great idea, and suddenly that gets put back on hold. Now, that comes down to one person holding the fee and trying to cover that, and that's really hard. And whereas a dance company or a ballet company are funded nationally and they're okay, but it's the one-off bands and musicians that I really feel for. Like Wayne Gillies running Village Music, putting events on, just a little, handfuls of dollars of profit, but being absolutely murdered by this.
Waiata anthems. There's so much that's been created to kind of celebrate the fact that we can go and attend concerts again, and it's all become uncertain. Yeah, it's devastating. But then I also, I really feel for instance, the New Zealand Dance Company who have been up until last week working for years towards the premiere of a show. It's anybody in that situation where they depend on a moment in time in order to be able to present their work.
Oh, goodness, I'm trying to see the positive in this, but you paint quite a picture. Victoria, Julia, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, ka roha kia koe kia rātou. I mean, I always say the creatives, this is a really struggle time when you're, I don't think they're going around making heaps of money, but there's lots of heart and work that goes into organising sorts of things. And of course, COVID is not something that anyone can really plan for, and this is a real kick in the guts. Especially, I can imagine second time round when you're just getting back on your feet, it feels even greater. Hard to see the good in it, just sending big kaha. So hopefully when we get out the other end, we still have our creatives, because everyone benefits from them as well. So we should be supporting them as well, more so. I don't know what government response is.
That's so right, because they're also the people who are going to be able to tell this story as well. Like, they are the people who will articulate it and archive it for us and, put it through their really unique lens of perception, so that when 100 years from now our grandchildren are looking back on this time, it's our artists today who will be documenting that for them,
Yeah. If you are in this situation, if you are a performer, a dancer, a violinist, a clarinetist, whatever you are, if you are in the creative sector, why don't you email me with your story on how you're doing? Email the panel at rnz.co.nz and we'll try and fit that in this week. But Victoria, thank you very, very much for being with us, and all the very best to you.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm sorry that I couldn't tell you a happier story.
No.
The truth's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Victoria Kelly, the composer and director of the New Zealand Members Services at APRA, and a wonderful show. Thank you so much, Julia and Peter, for making it so. So thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Paul.
That's me.
Thank you.
I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint next. I'm back with you for Thursday's show, 3:45 tomorrow. Thanks to Laura Dooney for preparing putting the show together. Till then, see you later.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, it's in with more Defence Force staff and out with the private security guards at managed isolation facilities. No new cases are linked to the Ridges maintenance man, but how could he catch a virus from someone in isolation that he apparently never met? So what are the missing pieces of the puzzle? We speak to Air Commodore Digby Webb. Air New Zealand's boss is with us too. Why aren't all international air crews forced to isolate? The new lockdown's costing 250 jobs a day in Auckland. New Zealand Rugby's confidence its North versus South game can go ahead. Selwyn Libraries say bye-bye to late fees. And can you still lick an envelope in these COVID times? We have the answer.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The National Party is rubbishing the latest move to improve testing at the border, describing it as an admission of failure. The government is deploying an extra 500 Defence Force staff at isolation hotels and bringing in a new team of advisors to support the testing strategy. The opposition leader Judith Collins says the government appears to have lost all control.
It's admission of failure. Police were put in charge at one part of some of the quarantine situations, returnees, then private security, and now the Defence Force. Clearly, there's no confidence in the system as it's been working.
And Judith Collins says the new team being brought in to improve the testing regime at the border shows the lack of talent and experience in the Cabinet. The Prime Minister has announced the team will be co-chaired by Heather Simpson, who recently reviewed the country's health system, and Sir Brian Roche, who led the recent review of PPE use. The High Court has agreed the country's Level 4 lockdown was unlawful for 9 days. Lawyer Andrew Borrowdale had argued that the Director-General of Health went beyond his powers when he put the country into lockdown in March. Jonathan Mitchell reports.
Andrew Borrowdale asked the High Court to rule on 3 actions by the government. The first was public statements made by the Prime Minister and officials during the first 9 days of lockdown. The second related to 3 orders made under the Health Act. And the third was the definition of essential services. In a written decision just released, the High Court has ruled from March the 26th to April the 3rd the requirement for people to stay at home and in their bubbles was justified but unlawful. However, it says a new order introduced on April the 3rd corrected that. The judges said Mr Borrowdale's other challenges have failed. Ko Jonathan Mitchell aho.
And the Attorney-General David Parker has responded to the ruling, saying there is no need to correct or change legislation as a result of the High Court decision. The police say there has been a large increase in the number of vehicles being turned around at the checkpoint on Auckland's boundary. As of yesterday afternoon, more than 86,000 vehicles had been stopped at the 13 different checkpoints, with almost 4,800 turned around. The police say on Monday and Tuesday, a significantly higher number of vehicles were turned around than in previous days. Wait times at the main checkpoints are decreasing, and more people are ready with their documentation or exemption letters. A group of Taranaki Whānui descendants opposing the sale of land at Shelley Bay in Wellington are shocked. Thousands of iwi members were unable to vote on the decision to sell. It's one of the findings of a Māori Land Court report by Sir Weda Gardner, who found the Port Nicholson Block Settlement Trust membership register was a mess. He found 9,000 members couldn't vote due to old addresses, and another 2,000 had their membership declined. Mo Whenua took the case to the Māori Land Court. Its spokesperson, Hirini Jenkins Mefam, says they only knew of 5,000 missing iwi members.
The numbers that we were told in the beginning, back in 2016, were far different from what was actually discovered in the research by Sir Weda. We were quite astonished at the sheer volume of it.
Mo Whenua spokesperson Hirini Jenkins Mefam. The police have seized houses, vehicles, firearms, cash and cannabis plants valued at $3.2 million in busts around the Bay of Plenty today. The police say 23 searches were carried out in Taupo, Hamilton and Rotorua. More than 3,000 cannabis plants were seized, along with 3 houses, 2 classic cars, 9 Harley-Davidson motorbikes, jewellery and more than $100,000 in cash. 20 people were arrested. All are due to appear in Rotorua District Court tomorrow on charges relating to cannabis cultivation and supply and participation in an organised criminal group. Tonga Media is reporting that Elisapeti Lavakeaho Makoni Langi has become the first woman in Tonga to be made a Supreme Court judge. She was appointed as a senior magistrate 2 years ago. It's 4.5 minutes past 5. There'll be no special treatment for the country's top rugby players to allow the North versus South match to go ahead, Sports Minister Grant Robertson has warned. The squads for the Inter-Island game are due to assemble in Wellington on Monday, but New Zealand Rugby needs to get exemptions for the 13 Auckland-based players to leave the region, which is currently in Level 3 lockdown. The Health Minister, Chris Hipkins, has indicated the players are unlikely to get an exemption, while Robertson says the players can't expect to be treated differently.
They'll need to go through the same exemption process that anyone else would, but clearly we are trying to limit movement in and out of Auckland, and so any exemption would have to meet a high threshold.
New Zealand Rugby is holding off until Friday before making a decision on whether the match goes ahead. The mainland Tactics have re-signed coach Marianne Delaney-Hoshek for a further 3 years. Delaney-Hoshek will stay with the ANZ Premiership netball franchise until 2023, meaning she'll be at the helm for 7 years. The Tactics are into their first grand final this weekend, playing the defending champs, the Pulse, in Invercargill. Stephen Adams' Oklahoma City Thunder have lost their first round NBA Western Conference basketball playoff match, going down 123-108 to the Houston Rockets. Adams scored 17 points and grabbed 12 rebounds for the Thunder. That's the news.
The government says it's doing all it can.
Within all these situations, we just have to keep watching because we can't rule anything out.
While the opposition ramps up the pressure on border control.
What we're seeing is from the government spin and spin and spin. We would never put New Zealanders at risk unnecessarily, and that is important.
And the experts continue to learn new things.
It's a real mystery, and it shows just how tricky this virus is.
The race to get on top of COVID-19 isn't slowing down. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, also Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Periods of rain with heavy falls, squally thunderstorms possible tomorrow. Northeasterly gales in exposed places east of Tauranga for a time. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, rain with some heavy falls, clearing for a time tomorrow morning. Easterlies rising to gale about coastal Gisborne for a time. Whanganui to Wellington, also Taihape and Wairarapa, rain at times. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain or showers, heavy at times. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy at times, scattered showers clearing overnight, then patchy drizzle developing tomorrow night. Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy tonight, rain with heavy falls and northerly gales tomorrow. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Coming up on the program, why the government will deploy 500 more troops at COVID-19 quarantine facilities to bolster security and public confidence amid revelations border staff have not been tested as often as they should. We'll hear from Air Commodore Darren Webb. We'll also hear from Air New Zealand boss Greg Foran on what the airline is doing to bolster the safety of flight crew. And New Zealand Post CEO Mark Stewart on why COVID-19 might delay the delivery of your online shopping. But we begin tonight with a mystery baffling our health experts. How did a Ridges hotel maintenance man contract a strain of COVID-19 from a hotel guest he apparently never came into contact with? Yesterday, the Ministry of Health confirmed the worker tested positive on August 16th, but the strain of the virus he had is not the same as the one linked to the Auckland community outbreak. Instead, it's the same as a returnee from the United States who arrived alone and left the facility in late July. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield says health authorities still don't know how the virus was transmitted because the man and the returnee never actually came into physical contact, although virus experts say human-to-human transmission is the most likely explanation. Our reporter Logan Church has been trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Test results so far from people considered to be close contacts of the maintenance man at Auckland's Ridges Hotel have resulted in one piece of good news.
There are no additional cases relating to the Ridges maintenance worker that we talked about yesterday.
But how he got COVID-19 still remains a mystery. Here is what we definitely know. The maintenance man entered what would soon become the US returnee's hotel room 2 times in late July. Once on the 21st of July to fix the TV, and the second time on the 23rd to fix the shower. The woman arrived 5 days later on the 28th and stayed for 4 days before testing positive on the 31st of July and was moved to the Jet Park quarantine facility. That room was not entered at all for 14 days. Meanwhile, the worker attended 2 church services on August the 9th and began showing symptoms of COVID-19, which he initially put down to a pre-existing condition, on the 11th. The worker was tested on the 13th of August as part of routine testing, with a positive result returned on the 16th of August. Despite the infected man being in the same room a week before, today Dr. Ashley Bloomfield confirms genome testing proved the returnee was the first one infected and not the other way round.
The variation that the maintenance worker has means that he caught it from the person who was the case diagnosed in the managed isolation facility and who had travelled from the USA, and so that matches there.
Dr. Bloomfield outlined 2 theories.
It's possible it could have been a direct infection, or it's possible there could have been an intermediary. That's what we know so far.
To test how realistic each of those are, we asked Dr. Gemma Geoghegan, a virologist at the University of Otago. She says it's highly likely this strain of the virus came into New Zealand from the US returnee.
All evidence points to the fact that they did contract the virus overseas and brought it with them. So they tested positive, and now we have a second case of the hotel worker that is linked to this case. However, there is no physical link there.
Dr. Geoghegan says in general, the virus passing between humans is a more likely scenario than surface transmission.
Well, human-to-human contact is a lot more likely than contaminated surfaces. But, we are still learning a lot more about this virus, and to be honest, the evidence changes daily. So it's really hard to sort of estimate that at the moment.
Dr. Geoghegan says it's simply not known how long this virus can remain on any surface. There are too many variables. But she says it is quite possible there is a missing link yet to be found. A person or people infected by the woman from the USA who then passed it on to the maintenance worker.
There are a couple of plausible scenarios. One is that we're missing the links. So there might be one or more people that have been infected that we're missing, and serology testing will hopefully clarify that if possible.
Serology testing tests a person's blood for COVID antibodies, which would reveal if they had the virus in the past, even if they don't have it now and wouldn't be picked up by normal COVID testing. Dr. Bloomfield confirmed that work was already underway.
Even if they've got a negative PCR test, if they have evidence of old infection, that may help us make the link.
And the Health Minister is confident that despite the Ridges Hotel situation being different from the Americold cluster, officials have it under control.
It looks like we got it early. The testing results suggest that the person's infection was recent, so that's helpful. All of the tests of their co-workers have come back negative so far. All of those people are in isolation and they will be tested again. All of the tests of the person's close contacts, their family, their household, have also come back negative. So that's promising. It suggests that we got that one early enough.
It's hoped further testing could still find the missing link to the Ridges Hotel maintenance man puzzle. For Checkpoint, Logan Church.
OK, so let's try and tease out some of the missing pieces of the puzzle with Air Commodore Darren Webb.
I guess what we are discovering is it certainly is complex business. Normally, person-to-person contact seems the most obvious, and that's where we've focused a lot of our attention. We've drawn swipe data card access from both the room and from his own movements, and we can just establish no obvious connection between the two. She was only there a short period before she was moved to the Jet Park, and so based on our interviews with them both, asking very specific questions as well as the swipe card access, it's just no obvious connection. And so then, I guess logically you're thinking a third person or some sort of environmental transfer.
So the worker was in the room twice before the guest arrived, right? On the 21st and 23rd of July. Was he wearing PPE the times he entered the room?
He certainly was, and that room was vacant, and the workers have very clear specific procedures to wear gloves and facial masks.
So he was wearing gloves and a facial mask at the time?
He was, Lisa.
He fixed the TV in the shower. Have those areas been surfaced swabbed?
That room was cleaned, and we use a hospital-grade cleaning device to clean these rooms. This isn't just a normal household cleaning system, so that room was absolutely clean.
So there's no point in taking swabs, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
So none have been taken from that room whatsoever?
I think what we're seeing is swabbing from a surface, an area that the Ministry of Health are looking into as a further option, and I believe they are looking into it across a range of areas as well.
So why was that room not cleaned for 14 days after she left?
It was cleaned, and it was vacant for that period.
It was vacant. So what day did the cleaning take place?
The room was cleaned on the 14th of August.
Right, so why such a big gap between when she left and the room was cleaned?
Well, we have a system in place where we align supply and demand. The room wasn't required during that period. There is a cleaning protocol which normally requires that room to be left vacant for 10 days. That's, again, at a health policy direction. So we left that room vacant for that period, and it was cleaned on the 14th of August in preparation for it to be used again.
Right, so was she travelling with anyone?
I believe she was alone.
Okay. Is there any proof that anyone else entered that room during the time the woman was there?
We have had a report of the nurse who entered the room and to take her health check.
And the nurse has been tested?
The nurse has been tested, and I believe she is being retested.
Okay, and so what does that test tell us? Was she negative? Has she been negative both times?
I'm still awaiting the advice from the retest, but I am of the understanding that she was negative the first test, but I will need to corroborate that through with the health department.
What about antibody testing of the nurse?
I don't think that's been taken place yet, but that's underway, and that takes around 3 days for that information to come back.
Okay, so how much of the maintenance person's movements have you been able to track using the swipe cards and CCTV footage? Put another way, where are the blind spots here?
Yeah, I mean, he was a busy maintenance man who manoeuvred around the hotel doing his everyday work. So we have him on different areas and different rooms doing normal functions that you would expect of a hotel maintenance man. Some CTV blind spots in any hotel, it doesn't have 100% coverage. Again, I come back to the point that she was only there a very short time. So we haven't been able to establish any other obvious points of contact, either from person to person or environmental.
So she was there from July 28th to July 31st. Was the maintenance man working on those days?
He was.
All of them?
That's my understanding.
So has he done maintenance on any rooms where the woman may have had contact with the guests from those other rooms?
It certainly doesn't appear that way, Lisa.
Okay. So what about the woman's movements? How fulsome a picture have you got of her movements from the swipe card and the CCTV footage? How often did she leave her room and where did she go?
Yeah, so she arrived from a flight from Los Angeles and she got into that hotel at 7:57 in the morning of the 28th of July. She largely stayed in her room. And she was out of her room for only 1 hour between approximately 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. on the 29th. And then she was in her room for the next period of time, right through to her transfer to the jet park at 10:50 in the morning on the 31st of July. And when you think about it logically, if she wasn't feeling particularly well, it appears at face value that she was in her room. She was probably recovering from her flight from LA, became unwell, sought attention from the nurse. She was tested on site there and then transferred to the Jet Park Hotel.
So she was literally only out of her room for 1 hour during her entire stay until the point that she left?
That is the information we have from the swipe card and everything that corroborates with her story.
When you say she got, obviously, attention from a nurse once she became unwell, is that the same nurse that entered her room?
Yeah, I was talking with the DG Health about that today. I think there was more than one nurse, and they are seeking all the data that they can about that nursing staff. She would get daily checks, of course, and then she would have had her actual swab test, which would have followed on from her positive case.
So there's potentially more than one nurse that she's had contact with?
So that's right. So they're looking at the nursing staff as we speak.
Have those nurses have contact with the maintenance man?
Not that we're aware of, no.
When the woman left the room, was she wearing a face mask?
she would have been wearing full PPE for her transfer to the Jet Park.
When she left for that hour between
my apologies.
9 and 10?
She would have been.
Have you checked that on CCTV?
The CCTV doesn't have full coverage across all parts of the facility, but the SOPs and this particular facility, like all of our facilities, is very hot on all of those IPCs, and I have questioned the staff there throughout the last 5 days that she would have been following protocols, which is to wear PPE.
Right, but you cannot confirm for sure that she was masked up when she left the room. You're saying that was standard operation protocol, but you've got no evidence that she was wearing a mask when she left the room.
I don't have a CCTV footage shot of her leaving the room, but what I'm just going on is the procedures in place and the investigations that have supported that so far.
Okay, so to the best of your knowledge then, the possible avenues for investigation are the nurses. They're the only potential common thread that you can see at the moment.
They seem the most likely. Again, we are around the world learning more and more about this virus every single day. So whether it's any other particular contact issue or third-party transfer or some other as yet unknown or undetected aspect, but that appears the most logical course to look further at the stage.
So you're retesting everybody who was at this particular hotel. Has that shown you anything yet?
Not yet. We have tested all of his close contacts, and they are negative. And so far, all of the analysis we've done has not proven any other positive case outcomes.
In terms of Ridge's staff and people who were working in and around that facility, have any of them left in the meantime who might not be in your employ for the second round of testing?
So you're talking about those people from the 14th of August onwards?
Yeah.
No, so we have everybody who's still on site, and we're going through that test and retest phase, and we'll be looking to seek health advice before we decide upon how long we think we should hold them for.
Okay, so also today we hear you're getting an extra 500 more defence personnel for the isolation and quarantine facilities. Why do you need them? What are they going to be doing?
Well, all the way along, Lisa, we've talked about the need for continuous improvement in all of our facilities, and so that's really what we're talking about. It's boosting on-site support for each of those facilities to provide a more enduring and sustainable plan.
So you're getting 80 extra at Maritime Border. Have there not been any there before?
We haven't had any Defence Force personnel assigned to the Maritime Border, but of course that border also is a critical part of New Zealand's, the border system, and so we are looking to put in 80 people to start with there at the border, yes.
So is this an admission that, you didn't have the resources that you needed to do the job?
Not at all. No, what we're saying is continuous improvement continues to be a really key part of what we're doing, and those extra defence personnel will be a really welcome boost to the system.
Okay, because you were brought in to apply military precision and rigour to the operation and function in MIQ. Have you been able to do that? Because there seems to be, there's been ongoing incidents, hasn't there? So is it harder than you thought it was going to be?
Well, as we've said all the way along, this is an absolutely complex system. We are running 32 facilities. At any given day, we've got the size of a small town spread across New Zealand. Up until now, we've successfully managed to reintegrate over 40,000 people back into New Zealand, Lisa. So what we're saying is it's a really robust system, but it is a system with people at the heart of it. And I guess I'll just take this opportunity to remind everybody who's listening, both inside those facilities and New Zealanders at home, that personal accountability lies at the very heart of defences to our protection against COVID. So it's certainly not easy. We're finding that. All the way along, we've said when we find things we need to fix, we will do that. It's only logical to expect things and minor things to go wrong all the way through, and we're finding that, but we'll fix them as we go.
And that was Air Commodore Darren Webb. It is 24 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. It really is the curious case of the maintenance man infected with COVID-19. We're keen for your feedback. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Air New Zealand staff say there are a multitude of loopholes in the airline's border controls, and COVID testing and isolation requirements need urgent attention. The Health Minister today met with Air New Zealand to discuss ways to tighten COVID restrictions after saying he was concerned with their procedures. Air New Zealand says while it's open to improvements, it hasn't had a COVID case in the airline since April and is confident the current protocols are working. Nita Blake-Person reports.
Passengers flying into New Zealand present one of our biggest vulnerabilities to COVID-19 making a comeback here. While returning travellers must undergo strict 14-day isolation requirements, the air crews bringing them home are largely exempt.
I think there's a multitude of loopholes, and some of them are due to the way the airline operates. But also, unfortunately, I believe that the loopholes and the vulnerabilities at the border are due to the way things have been designed by Ministry of Health rules.
This Air New Zealand staffer spoke to Checkpoint under condition of anonymity. He says there's been unease for some time among crews about the current rules, which mean only those returning from America are required to self-isolate, have a COVID-19 test on day 2, and continue to self-isolate until the results of that test have been returned. These are his words, but not his voice.
There's no requirement for me to stop, isolate, or even get a test after coming back from anywhere that isn't America. However, I'm doing that because voluntarily, because it's the right thing to do. So I am managing the quarantine at home purely because we have enough space. But many crew have difficulty with that. They might have flatmates, or they might have the situation be so that they cannot physically isolate at home without putting people at risk.
He says it's vital there is a stand-down period and testing between every international flight, especially because currently the burden is placed entirely on the crew themselves, and staff can fly home domestically to self-isolate after completing a long-haul flight.
In my mind, every flight is similar risk, and it's regardless of how many days you're over in those destinations. They all carry the same amount of risk, and I don't know why the Ministry of Health or New Zealand is able to justify having lower testing requirements for certain trips.
The Ministry of Health website states that because of the importance of maintaining international air routes, New Zealand-based international aircrew are mostly exempt from requirements for isolation if they meet certain conditions. They include wearing gloves and masks when in passenger areas and full PPE when dealing with a sick passenger suspected of having COVID-19. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says those requirements have been agreed on with health authorities.
So those are protocols that have all been worked through with the Ministry of Health and Air New Zealand based on questions around who they're exposed to, whether or not they stop. For pilots, for instance, I understand coming out of Australia, they don't leave their cockpit the entire time. So that assessment has been done between Health and Air New Zealand. Again, as with our constant improvements, I know the Minister of Health met with Air New Zealand this morning to talk about how we can continually beef up the regime that we have. Again, nothing at this point to demonstrate that's been where we've had issue here.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins says he discussed testing requirements during his meeting with Air New Zealand this morning.
So one of the things that we've got to look at is what the testing regimes on the other side are. In some cases, aircrew are being required to test before they leave the country. They're being required to test when they arrive in another country, and then they're being asked to test when they get back to New Zealand, which clearly is an unsustainable level of testing for one person to undertake. It wouldn't be in their own health interests to do that. So we've just got to work our way through all of those practical ins and outs to make sure that the regime is as robust as possible.
The staffer says while Air New Zealand is doing the right thing most of the time, isolation and testing on every international flight has to happen.
They have a fiscal imperative, which is weighing very heavily on, of course, everyone, and they would not want to have the extra cost of the stand down between every single flight and the testing. They would not want that, but it's the only way to have better surety and protection from the virus getting back into our community.
Air New Zealand Chief Executive Greg Foran says he's supportive of the government considering options for improvements to their current testing regime, and adds the protocols the airline has in place are working because there hasn't been a case of COVID-19 in the airline since early April. For Checkpoint, Nita Blake-Person.
As you heard there, the boss of Air New Zealand believes COVID safety measures for international aircrew are strict enough and sees no reason to change them. The Ministry of Health has signalled the Minister of Health has signalled he's aiming to release an order this week clarifying rules for aircrews. And as you heard in that story, at the moment the guidelines mean only crews returning from America, that's considered to be a high-risk destination, have to self-isolate for 48 hours until they return a negative COVID test. test. And crews flying into Auckland are free to immediately travel onwards domestically to their home destination. Air New Zealand's CEO, Greg Foran, is adamant the protocols they have in place are working just fine.
Not all systems are watertight, but there are effective ways to minimise risk, and I think our record, Air New Zealand's record since April, shows that those measures are working. And I think it's also good that you constantly review them.
When you say your record since April shows that, what do you mean?
Well, we've not had any COVID cases from any Air New Zealanders since April 7th.
Okay.
So, despite all the flying that we're doing, and, we're into the United States and up to Asia and Australia, and dealing with lots and lots of passengers around New Zealand, no COVID cases in any Air New Zealanders. And there's a reasonable degree of testing that's going on as well. So, about 1,300 of our international crew have been tested over that period, and they're all been fine.
What is that as a percentage of the number who are flying then?
Well, in terms of total pilots, we've got around about 1,400, about a similar number of cabin crew. But in terms of international, that 1,300 would be everyone.
Okay, so you've had a discussion with the Minister of Health, as I understand it. Are you expecting him to tighten things up this week? He's already indicated that he's going to issue a health order, and one of those is going to relate specifically to flight crews. Are you expecting changes?
Well, we had a terrific conversation today, and it's not the first one that we've had. We've had conversations. I've spoken with him previously and also with his predecessor. So we'll continue to work through with him. I'm not across where his exact thinking is at the moment. We had a good dialogue this morning, and I shared with him what we were doing, and we're all on the same page there. And he's going to come back to me with anything that he requires. And
did he raise any concerns, Greg?
No, he was very interested to know exactly how it operated and the differences between the United States and Australia, and what happens when you're flying into China. So we spoke through all of those at some length, and as I said, he'll come back to me with any thoughts he's got following discussions with his team.
Okay, well, let's look specifically at the current situation. So only crew returning from the United States need to self-isolate until they return a negative COVID test. So why not have the same rules for all returning international airline crews?
Well, it's based on a risk-based approach, and clearly the United States and the two ports we fly to there, Los Angeles and San Francisco, are a higher risk than Australia. In Australia, we actually, with the exception of two flights only that go through to Norfolk Island, the crew, including the pilots, actually never leave the plane. So the rest of the flying that we do to Australia, you don't actually leave the plane. In the case of Samoa and in the case of Hong Kong, there are actually tests that are done before you leave the country. So you're not allowed to crew out on those until you've completed a test. And in the case of Shanghai, there's a test which is completed upon arrival. So, there is a reasonably significant regime in place to ensure safety for all concerned at this point.
Yeah, but there are a lot of moving parts there. So even if you are tested at a port that you arrive in or leave from, the incubation period for the virus is 14 days. So you can't be sure, just because you've returned a negative test on that day, that you're not going to return a positive one in 14 days' time. You can't be sure of that, can you?
Well, as I said, not every system is watertight. There's a few in the world that are, but, the system is not watertight. But I think we've got in place some effective ways to minimise the risk. And as I've already mentioned, our record since April shows that these measures are working. So no COVID cases on any Air New Zealanders since the 7th of April.
Then what could be done to tighten up what you're doing now at the moment?
Well, we'll continue to work through with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Transport and look at anything else we can do. We've implemented more measures last week with Auckland going into level 3, so clearly we're back to some social distancing at this point. But we've also ensured that everyone's got masks when they're departing Auckland. We're strongly encouraging masks around the rest of the country and providing those, hand sanitizer, And as well as that, we've changed how we're setting customers on flights and crew are wearing gloves. So we're doing everything that we can here to minimise the risk. And as I said, it's working.
So what checks do you do to make sure that the crew are not leaving their homes?
We've actually had audits completed on that, working through with the Ministry of Health. And I also have complete trust in our staff to do what's right. And I'm confident that they are.
But people are only human, Greg, and you've had situations previously where you've had to stand down crew because you're not sure that they were following the rules. So what kind of audit did you do besides trust?
Well, it's an audit which actually is done in association with the Ministry of Health to ensure that we are following procedures. We are a very compliant group. If you think about airlines, very strict on safety. That's, our number one concern. And as I said, I'm very confident and have a lot of trust in our people. For sure, we are human, but the results speak for themselves in terms of the success we've had to date.
And that's Air New Zealand CEO Greg Foran. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, there will be no special treatment for top rugby players wanting a pass out of Auckland for the North-South match. Some New Zealand Post courier customers can expect delays after 2 workers test positive for COVID-19. Auckland's mayor fears this latest lockdown will send businesses barely hanging on over the edge. And some good news for some bookworms. With time management issues, some library fees are being written off. We would love your feedback. Get in touch. Do you think the rules that Air New Zealand international crew are operating under are tough enough? 500 more defence staff are headed into managed isolation, and the government's going to start employing its own private security guards. So let us know what you think of all of that. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us at Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now with Susanna.
The government's moves to improve testing at the border are being labelled an admission of failure. 500 extra Defence Force staff will be deployed at isolation hotels, while a new advisory group is also being set up to oversee border staff testing. The National Party leader Judith Collins says this is an admission of no confidence in the systems already in place. Meanwhile, officials have reported 6 new cases of COVID-19 today, 5 linked to the Auckland cluster and 1 in managed isolation. The Attorney-General says a High Court ruling that the country's Level 4 lockdown was unlawful for 9 days validates many of the actions taken during the early stages of the lockdown. Lawyer Andrew Borrowdale had argued that the Director-General of Health went beyond his powers when he put the country into full lockdown in March. The High Court has ruled from March the 26th to April the 3rd, the requirement for people to stay in their bubbles was justified but unlawful. However, it says a new order introduced on April the 3rd corrected that. A Hamilton-based chartered accountant has been jailed for 3 years after being found guilty of fraud to fund a gambling problem and holidays. Megan Nairi Findlay was sentenced today in the Hamilton District Court for filing fraudulent GST and income tax returns on behalf of her family's company. Severe weather warnings have been in place for Northland and Auckland today as strong gales and rain lashed the regions. Over the past 24 hours, Kerikeri received more than 60 millimetres of rain. Whangarei 35 mils and Auckland's North Shore 30 millimetres. Hong Kong has downgraded its typhoon warnings as its strongest storm of the year to date starts to move away. Most businesses and the city stock market were shut down while a typhoon passed over the territory, but have now started to reopen. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Let's head to business news now with Emma Hatton, who's in our Wellington studio. Emma, so there's more earnings reports. Hit us with the good ones.
Yeah, let's start with the good. So A2 Milk, so this is a local stock market heavyweight, of course the specialty dairy company. They recorded a record full-year profit of $386 million and its revenue actually rose by a third to a whopping $1.73 billion. And infant formula sales, which is its major product, made up the lion's share of that. 80% of that was from infant formula sales. And that was primarily due to a really strong demand because of the pandemic, particularly from its China and Australia markets. And this was actually something that we saw creep up quite frequently throughout all this when we're talking to various companies and the demands they were seeing, is that demand from offshore markets for New Zealand products was really strong because of the way that New Zealand had responded to the pandemic. Obviously our strong lockdown restrictions made international headlines and we got on top of things quite quickly, and we had such a long time before a new case came in. We were seen as a really responsible and, a safe place to get food from because we took these health precautions really, really seriously. So that was reflected in what we saw with A2 Milk. And they sort of capitalised on that. They spent a record amount on marketing, just that really trusted brand, that reputational factor really, really coming into play. And obviously it really paid off for them because they had a whopper there. Another good one, well, I don't know if it's good, but it was in this environment, breaking even is actually pretty good here, particularly for retail, which is what this one is. And this is the Halenstein's Glassons Group. So obviously, despite being retail, where they had to shut a number of their stores across New Zealand and Australia for quite a period of time, their sales were actually slightly up on last year. And it's yet to, formally lay out its results, but it sent out some guidance earlier in the day today. And it expects its profit to be only slightly down on last year, about 5%, so more or less even there. And what saved it was its online sales. They went gangbusters, basically. In the second half of the year, they were up 80% on the same time last year. So the company, it was pretty agile. It already had its e-commerce platforms and its payment systems and its distribution stores already set up. They already did online. So they took any opportunity they could to sell, even in level 4 in New Zealand, they were selling some essential items like, winter coats and things like that. So that really paid off for them. That they're expecting to report a really good result when that comes through. And their share price, that was really reflected in it. It went way up, 24.5% at one point, and I think it's closed up 20%. So, yeah, really good result for them as well.
Okay, well, let's move on to the ones who may not be as happy. Fletcher Building.
That's right. So we knew this was coming. They signalled last week in some guidance that they were going to make a loss, and that was confirmed today. Loss of $196 million, and that's compared to a profit last year of $164 million. So massive turnaround in fortunes there, and that was pretty much all because of the pandemic. Their revenue took a hit. Projects, of course, were put on hold, so massive costs there. And then in all of this as well, they foresaw that the pipeline of work that they'd be able to get after the restrictions were lifted would be a lot less than they previously thought. And so they moved very quickly to downsize their business. They did that big restructure, which was in the news not long ago. 1,500 staff made redundant across New Zealand and Australia. Plus some other one-off costs, closed some unprofitable product lines and some manufacturing facilities. That cost it $276 million in the year just gone. Obviously, it's going to be good for them in the long run because that's a cost that they've just had to weather as a one-off now. But nevertheless, this is when it's hit it. But it's optimistic that it's done the right things now to preserve it for the future. It's got a good pipeline of new work coming through, high quality work that's low risk and with quite good margins on it. So it's got a $2.4 billion sort of forward order book there, which it's very happy about. Not so optimistic as to pay its shareholders a dividend today, though.
Emma, can we quickly touch on ANZ Bank too?
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely worth mentioning. So we had their third quarter results come through today, and they also show a bit of a hit from the pandemic. I mean, they still made $351 million in the 3 months to June, but that was down on the previous quarter by about $40 million. They're also gearing up for more bad debts. So this is customers who default on their loans and can't make their repayments, so the money they were banking on through that, gearing up for some of those loans to fail. They've put aside an extra $79 million for those, and that's on top of about $230 million they put aside in the first half of the year. So they're foreseeing that that's going to be potentially something that really knocks them later on if they start to show through in any sort of magnitude. So it's not terrible, bad, awful news, but it is just another sign that the pandemic is making its mark on some of these really, really big companies. It also showed in these third quarter results, interestingly, they've issued $7.4 billion worth of new lending to customers and businesses. They have, of course, been urged repeatedly by the Reserve Bank to be courageous with their lending and keep lending. And they are, but they are saying we're making sure we're only lending to people who we know can pay it back.
Right, so how was the market feeling today?
Yeah, market actually closed down a touch, 0.8%. It's going to start tomorrow at 11,751 points. New Zealand dollar is currently trading at 66 US cents, 91 Australian and 49.9 pence.
Thanks, Emma. That's Emma Hatton with our business news, joining us from our Wellington studio there. Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has promised a vaccine will be available for free to all Australians, and he wants to make it mandatory unless there are medical reasons not to have it. Morrison's government has signed a deal with a UK-based drugs company to manufacture the potential COVID vaccine. It comes as the World Health Organization warns against what it calls vaccine nationalism, putting the global recovery from the pandemic at risk. The ABC's Nick Grimm reports.
In what's regarded by many as the birthplace of the coronavirus, images of young people disregarding social distancing at a pool party in Wuhan didn't escape the attention of medical experts at the World Health Organization.
I did see the picture that you are referring to, but I would like to point out that I have seen almost exactly that same picture in probably every country globally right now.
And WHO epidemiologist Maria van Kerkhove went on to point out that even in the city that's experienced the longest exposure to COVID, there's little likelihood of natural immunity amongst the population.
What we've learned from the studies available to date is that less than 10% of the population has evidence of antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 virus.
A point driven home by the WHO's Emergencies Program Director, Mike Ryan.
As a global population, we are nowhere close to the levels of immunity required to stop this disease transmitting. And we need to focus on what we can actually do now to suppress transmission and not live in hope of herd immunity being our salvation. Right now, that is not a solution.
And right now, those hopes are pinned on the race to develop a vaccine or vaccines that can halt the disease's spread. More than 160 are currently under development globally. But it comes amid concerns that too many nations are going it alone, with World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus warning of what he calls vaccine nationalism, impeding the fight against the disease.
Nationalism exacerbated the pandemic and contributed to the total failure of the global supply chain. For a period of time, some countries were without key supplies, such as key items for health workers who were dealing with surging cases of COVID-19. It's critical that countries don't repeat the same mistakes. We need to prevent vaccine nationalism.
But here in Australia, the federal government has thrown support behind one of the frontrunners, the Prime Minister announcing UK-based drug company AstraZeneca will locally produce a COVID vaccine developed by scientists at Oxford University. It will be provided free to Australians, but only if trials show it works without any major side effects.
The vaccine will need to satisfy all the same standards that all vaccines are expected to live up to here in Australia before they're made available to the public. There won't be any cutting corners, there won't be any undue haste here. I'm advised that we'll need about a 95% vaccination rate across the country. Now, that is the normal target range for when you're having a vaccination program, and we'll be seeking to ensure that that is widely implemented with our partners around the country to ensure that should the vaccine be available, then we'll be able to move quickly, get it out across Australia, and that we can get Australia back to normal as quickly as we possibly can. But there's a lot of work to do yet.
Scott Morrison has emphasised Australia isn't putting all of its eggs in one basket, though. Australia is a signatory to the WHO's COVAX vaccine development program, which aims to ensure wealthier nations help the rollout of a successful candidate to the rest of the world. But whatever solution comes first, there's still a long way to go.
The ABC's Nick Grimm with that report. Staying in Australia, and Victoria's had another drop in coronavirus cases. Today reporting 216 new infections and 12 more deaths. It's a slight improvement on yesterday's numbers, which were the best the state has seen for a month. All of today's confirmed deaths are linked to aged care homes. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Victoria appears to be getting the outbreak under control.
We have seen, I think, that corner turn, and that, I hope, is of some great encouragement to Victorians. There is still a way to go yet, but and there is still some difficult news as we continue to see the most vulnerable of our community fall victim to that virus, and there will still be more of that news to come, as we've warned. But I am encouraged by the progress that's being made and the partnership efforts that is in place, whether it's the ADF, whether it's the Emergency Management Australia, whether it's nurses from Townsville and Western Australia and South Australia, contact tracers and testing equipment in Tasmania. The national resource, state and federal, has been turned to support Victoria, and that's our approach.
Meanwhile, New South Wales recorded 7 new cases today. Queensland has had 1 new case, a returning traveller who is now in quarantine. But Victoria's second wave of coronavirus is a cautionary tale for the rest of Australia. Tough restrictions and border closures have been imposed across the country, even in places that have had relatively low numbers in comparison. While there are clear public health benefits, the rules mean families and loved ones may be separated for several more months, often in tragic circumstances. The ABC's Bridget Fitzgerald reports.
Damien Sparks visited his mum in late June, not knowing it'd be the last time he'd get to see her. She died last week and he's unable to be at her funeral tomorrow. His application to travel from his home in Adelaide to the Victorian seaside town of Torquay was denied.
Mum died on a Thursday. Monday morning, I found out that I wasn't granted exemption. And the note quite simply said, you can travel to Victoria, but you will be refused entry into South Australia.
What does it mean for someone like you to not be able to be there with the rest of your family?
Well, it's shattering, and I don't use that phrase lightly. For all sorts of reasons, I make jokes to my other family members that I was mum's favourite because I was the youngest. For instance, my mother was a keen football supporter, and her and I would speak before and after every game on the phone, and something I'm not going to be able to do again.
South Australia imposed a hard border with Victoria in early July after COVID-19 cases spiked in Melbourne. Travel in and out of Victoria has been restricted by every state and territory in recent weeks, while Tasmania's strict border measures have been extended until December, and Western Australia will keep its hard border that locks all interstaters out for months to come.
Border closures are necessary when there's an outbreak, and if it's going to be done, it has to be done properly where there are no or very few exceptions.
Adrian Esterman's a professor of biostatistics and epidemiology at the University of South Australia. He says even in places with little or no community transmission of the virus, border closures alone won't keep people completely safe.
That's exactly why we need to keep doing our testing, we need to keep our social distancing and keep reminding the general public how important this is until we can crack this with the vaccine.
Professor James McCaw from the University of Melbourne is an epidemiologist on the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, helping track the pandemic spread for state and federal governments.
When epidemiologically we talk about elimination, we're referring to the elimination of the virus,
but we're never referring to the elimination of the threat or the risk. And New Zealand is, in a sense, tragically, a really good example of this.
Damien Sparks is under no illusion the threat is real and serious. He planned to drive across the border on his own and self-isolate upon his return, but he was still denied. He's hoping for more compassion in situations like his.
I just think that this blanket coverage of no, you can't come in, I think is unfair because for all intents and purposes, I would have been doing the right thing.
Adelaide resident Damien Sparks ending that report by Bridget Fitzgerald. It is 7 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. New Zealand Rugby isn't in line for any special treatment to ensure its North-South match goes ahead next weekend. Health Minister Chris Hipkins says it's unlikely 13 Auckland-based players will be granted exemptions to travel to Wellington if Auckland stays in Alert Level 3 and the match moves to the capital. Clay Wilson reports.
It's the revival of a match which used to be a staple on the New Zealand rugby calendar. But there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding next weekend's scheduled North-South inter-island clash. Sports Minister Grant Robertson this afternoon confirming no update on the all-important travel exemptions for 13 Auckland-based players.
No, there's not. Obviously, they'll need to go through the same exemption process that anyone else would and put their case forward.
Robertson's comments come after Health Minister Chris Hipkins indicated the obstacles in front of New Zealand rugby may be bigger than they thought. Hipkins telling Morning Report he was unaware of any request from NZR for exemptions and doubtful they would even be possible.
We're certainly being very, very limited in the exemptions we're giving. For example, even members of Parliament from Auckland are not travelling to Wellington for Parliament sitting at the moment. We are saying to people, please do your bit and stay in Auckland.
The 13 players in question, almost a quarter of those selected for the match, need the clearance to travel to Wellington, where both squads are set to assemble on Monday. That's also where they may stay, with the capital in line to host if Auckland doesn't drop down from Level 3 next Wednesday. All Blacks coach Ian Foster says they're preparing as best they can for any eventuality.
We don't actually want to push too many buttons on any alternative plans until we know what the government's intending to announce on Friday, and we know no more than you guys. So right now we're just pushing ahead.
New Zealand Rugby has reiterated that sentiment, confirming only that they are going through the process for exemptions and awaiting Friday's government update with interest. It's unclear what NZR will do if the exemptions are denied. But in the wake of the uncertainty added by the Health Minister, Grant Robertson's position suggests the national body still have significant hoops to jump through.
Clearly, we are trying to limit movement in and out of Auckland, and so any exemption would have to meet a high threshold.
A lot to be done to ensure a match a lot are looking forward to can indeed be played. For Checkpoint, Clay Wilson.
Now, a bit of good news for bookworms with time management problems. Libraries in the Selwyn district in Canterbury have stopped charging fines for overdue books in an effort to entice people scared off by their historic debts. Rachel Graham has more.
Wellington City libraries are owed $500,000 in overdue fines. One single customer has a hefty late fees bill to the tune of $1,100. Across the country, many libraries no longer charge for overdue children's books, but almost all still charge for adult books, with Auckland charging $1 for every day overdue. The head of the Selwyn District Council's libraries, Nikki Moen, says during the lockdown theirs was one of many libraries which dropped overdue fines for adults, and the council is now given the backing to continue that for a 2-year trial. She hopes it will encourage more people to make use of the library, and she has a plan to get books back.
Colleagues, when they're not serving walk-in customers, are going to start phoning customers who've got outstanding books. So part of my proposal to council was to be very active in trying to get those books back, and if they've been lost, to get them paid for. So there will be some revenue generation from that. We're not going to let those lost books stay lost.
Nikki Moen says the move will carry a cost for the library. It usually brings in $50,000 a year, but the expectation is that would drop to $10,000. The director of the Association of Public Library Managers, Hilary Beaton, says funding from fines is always uncertain anyway, because if everyone returned their books on time, they would get nothing.
And there's no evidence that fines actually make people bring books back on time. I think that's a really important thing. And I think if libraries are truly for everyone, they need to get rid of fines.
She says library fines put off those most in need of the service.
You know, libraries level the playing field. Fees prevent people from accessing resources. It's actually the fear of fines that stops them coming. And we don't want that.
In Christchurch, the council collected just over $315,000 in fines last year. The head of Libraries and Information, Carolyn Robertson, agrees dropping fines could be beneficial, but says in the current financial climate, she can't see how the library could make up the shortfall.
To have something to offset the revenue that we actually bring in from library fines from another area of revenue, for example, I really don't have anything at the moment that I can think would substitute for that. So our fines comprises just over 20% of our current revenue, or when we look at the last full year. So that's a considerable amount of funding.
Ms Robertson says moving away from fines is a growing trend overseas, and she will watch with interest how things go in Selwyn. For Checkpoint, this is Rachel Graham.
Some feedback before the news on the COVID Tracer app. This person says, wanting to do my bit for the cause as one of the 5 million, I tried to download the app, no luck. Diligent to the end, I travelled 90 minutes to the nearest Spark shop, and Thames waited 40 minutes in the one in, one out line, only to be informed my smartphone is not app compatible. It does take good photos though, maybe shots of the QR codes will suffice, they say.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Ridges Hotel maintenance man who contracted the same strain of COVID-19 as a hotel guest he apparently never met was wearing full PPE when he entered the guest's room. Yesterday, the Ministry of Health confirmed the worker tested positive on August the 16th, 2 weeks after the woman who had returned from the United States left the hotel. The official in charge of mandatory quarantine services, Air Commodore Darren Webb, says the worker was in full protective clothing when he entered the room many days after the guest had departed.
He certainly was, and that room was vacant, and the workers have very clear specific procedures to wear gloves and facial masks.
Air Commodore Darren Webb. The Attorney-General says a High Court ruling that the country's Level 4 lockdown was unlawful for 9 days validates many of the actions taken during the early stages of the lockdown. Lawyer Andrew Borrowdale had argued the Director-General of Health went beyond his powers when he put the country into full lockdown in March. The High Court has ruled from March the 26th to April the 3rd the requirement for people to stay in their bubbles was justified but unlawful. However, a new order then corrected that. David Parker says the ruling has no practical implications for the government.
We've got no plan to pass validating legislation. We don't think it's necessary. The orders are all fine. The effects on businesses, of course, were in respect of the early order which closed down all business premises other than essential services.
David Parker says none of the charges laid under the Health Act during the relevant time, including for businesses opening when they shouldn't have, are affected by the judgment. The government is bringing in 500 more Defence Force personnel as it bolsters its presence at isolation and quarantine facilities. It's also been announced private security companies will no longer be hired at high-risk facilities, and where security guards are used, they will be directly employed by MB and paid a living wage. A new team has also been announced to support the Ministry of Health in overseeing a testing strategy for staff at the border and managed isolation facilities. Officials have reported 6 new cases of COVID-19 today, 5 linked to the Auckland cluster and 1 in managed isolation. 900 applications for exemptions to the travel restrictions in Auckland have been approved, but thousands of applications still have to be processed. 13 checkpoints are controlling traffic in and out of the city, while the region is at alert level 3. Almost 90,000 vehicles have been stopped by police so far, and almost 5,000 have been turned around. The Health Minister Chris Hipkins says officials are processing exemption applications as quickly as possible.
As at 11 o'clock this morning, the Ministry of Health had approved around 900 applications. They declined around 90, and there are around 7,000 in the system awaiting to be processed.
Chris Hipkins, the Health Minister. Some Auckland businesses teetering on the edge of collapse during the first lockdown may do so this time around. The City Council's chief economist is expecting about 250 jobs are being lost a day under Level 3 restrictions. Another economist, Brad Olsen from Infometrics, says many companies are now more vulnerable than they were before the first lockdown, having burnt through their reserves. And he says the potential of further lockdowns is a harsh reality.
Realising that COVID-19 is going to exist with us for an extended period of time, and that means that planning for business operations needs to include that persistent risk, realising that we could well go into different restrictions at different points over the next year or so ahead.
Brad Olsen from Infometrics. Severe weather warnings were in place for Northland and Auckland today as strong gales and rain lashed the regions. Over the past 24 hours, Kerikeri received more than 60 millimetres of rain, Whangarei 35 mils and Auckland's North Shore 30 millimetres. A NIWA meteorologist, Chris Brandolino, says any rain in Auckland will help the region recover from the severe drought.
We certainly want the rain to occur over the dams here in the Auckland region. The drought is over with, we should mention that. So there's really no more drought per se, but oftentimes the effects of a drought can linger several months on.
However, Watercare is still urging Aucklanders to conserve water as its reservoirs are still well down on normal levels. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 6. The prospect of the North versus South rugby match going ahead appears to be growing slimmer by the day. The squads for the Inter-Island game are due to assemble in Wellington on Monday, but New Zealand Rugby needs to get exemptions for the 13 Auckland-based players to leave the region. The Health and Sports Ministers have indicated the players are unlikely to get an exemption. New Zealand Rugby is holding off until Friday before making a decision on the match. Meanwhile, the Farah Palmer Cup women's rugby competition has been rescheduled to kick off on September the 5th. The new draw pushes the competition start date out 2 weeks, but still allows for teams to compete a full schedule of matches, with the final to be played on the last weekend of October, subject to COVID-19 alert levels. Paris Saint-Germain are through to their first ever Champions League final with a 3-0 win over the German club Leipzig. PSG will play the winner of tomorrow's other semi-final between Bayern Munich and Olympique Lyonnais. An online fantasy sports company has paid $45 million for the naming rights of this year's Indian Premier League. Dream 11 sponsored last summer's Super Smash T20 competition in New Zealand. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
For some students, offering them the opportunity to come back to school is a really positive thing.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
I don't think you need to come in knowing a lot. If you're enthusiastic and love animals and want to be a team player, then I think shepherding is a great opportunity.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, also Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Periods of rain with heavy falls. Squally thunderstorms are possible tomorrow. Nor'easterly gales in exposed places east of Tauranga for a time. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay rain with some heavy falls, clearing for a time tomorrow morning. Easterlies rising to gale about coastal Gisborne for a time. Whanganui to Wellington, also Taihape and Wairarapa, rain at times. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, periods of rain or showers, heavy at times. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy, scattered showers clearing overnight, then patchy drizzle developing tomorrow night. And Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy tonight, rain with heavy falls and northerly gales tomorrow. RNZ National, coming up to 7.5 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The government has unveiled a high-profile team of troubleshooters to help protect the country's border, and it's scaling back the use of private security guards at managed isolation facilities, opting instead to bring in another 500 Defence Force personnel. But private firms who say they were blindsided by the decision insist bureaucrats aren't set up to be a security company. Catherine Hutton reports.
At today's media conference, the Prime Minister insisted everything was going according to plan. There are 6 new cases of COVID-19 and 5 people remain in Auckland hospitals. One of those cases was from overseas, while the other 5 are related to the current Auckland cluster. And then Jacinda Ardern announced the establishment of a small team, headed by Heather Simpson and Sir Brian Roche, to review the government's multi-agency response.
The wider team will bring together a range of public sector management and health expertise, as well as knowledge of the operation of our health and border systems and the management of infectious diseases. Key here, I think, to recall is that we are implementing here a strategy that cuts across multiple government agencies.
That was followed by a second major change. The government plans to stop using private security guards at isolation facilities where they monitor risky points like entry and exits in public areas. They'll be replaced with Defence Force staff. Some will also be stationed at the sea border to help customs staff.
Where we are using security guards, we're looking to directly employ them by MB, who will train and pay a living wage. This will raise accountability and give more central control over procedures. While the current community cluster has not been sourced to a managed isolation and quarantine facility, strengthening security is always an important step.
Jacinda Ardern insisted these changes had been in the pipeline for some time, but the organisation representing private security firms rubbishes that claim and complains they've been hampered by poor communication and lack of consultation. The head of the New Zealand Security Association, Gary Morrison, says they became aware of discussions between MIMBI and security providers 2 days ago. Yesterday they tried contacting ministers and unions to try and find out what was going on.
The message that was given from MB to the security providers concerned was that at that stage it would not be proceeding.
Can you spell out for me what would not be proceeding?
The movement of Army personnel to supplant the use of security staff on those sites.
Mr Morrison says he's received no details other than the press release, which says MIMBI will employ security staff directly, pay them a living wage and train them. He's not sure if that means MIMBI will employ staff through the security providers or they will employ security staff directly. Mr Morrison says if MIMBI employs staff directly, that will mean the loss of 600 jobs, while many firms are already paying the living wage and training their staff.
They're not skilled security staff. They're not used to managing teams, etc. They don't have the standard operating procedures to ensure that services are delivered correctly. We found that already with the managed isolation facilities where security's got involved, often on short notice. There have been no standard operating procedures and we've been tasked with developing those. So it's not a skill base that MB will have as core values on the way they operate.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says the new group of government troubleshooters is necessary to ensure the messages we're getting across to port authorities, borders and a range of facilities.
Health, as I've said, are leading the charge on our resurgence plan. I don't think we should leave it to them alone to implement testing and surveillance testing that is across such a range of agencies without having that extra support to do it.
National isn't convinced. The party's leader, Judith Collins, says she has no confidence the group will improve the situation.
I'm starting to think that they might as well just make Brian and Heather cabinet ministers and be done with it, because frankly the government seems to have lost all control.
Details of who else is on the team alongside Heather Simpson and Sir Brian Roche will be unveiled by the Health Minister at the end of the week. For Checkpoint, ko Catherine Hutton, tēnei.
Auckland's mayor has been warned businesses teetering on the edge of collapse during the first lockdown may go to the wall this time around. The council's chief economist is expecting around 250 jobs are being lost a day under level 3 restrictions, with about a quarter of the city's workforce unable to work at all. Jordan Bond reports.
Infometrics economist Brad Olsen describes Auckland's business environment as precarious and uncertain. Not good words for a business owner to hear. For round 2 of lockdown, Mr Olsen says many companies are in a more vulnerable financial state with fewer cash reserves.
They don't have the sort of the fallbacks that they previously had. And I think for a lot of businesses, there's also that general toll of wondering when this will end.
He says face-to-face businesses, retail, hospitality and tourism will feel the most pain. To add to the uncertainty of how long the current restrictions will last, the spectre of further lockdowns is now more real. He calls this a reality check for businesses all around the country.
realising that COVID-19 is going to exist with us for an extended period of time, and that means that planning for business operations needs to include that persistent risk, realising that we could well go into different restrictions at different points over the next year or so ahead.
More than a quarter of Auckland's 900,000 workers can't work at all under Level 3 restrictions. Council figures show the first lockdown cost 24,000 Aucklanders their jobs, despite the $585 a week wage subsidy. Now, with fewer restrictions, the council predicts another 250 people a day are being told they don't have a job anymore. Auckland Mayor Phil Goff says winning a wage subsidy extension was his number one priority for keeping Aucklanders employed.
That's what will enable a whole lot of businesses to continue through a pretty challenging and difficult period.
But relief for another large fixed cost, rent, is not a priority being pushed in the beehive by the Mayor. Auckland Council's chief economist, David Norman, says even if businesses can weather this storm, all forecasts and future plans come with a big caveat.
If things go well and it looks like we can get things under control over a couple of weeks, then that might be all we need at that level, but things could equally go the other way. And that means that businesses don't have certainty, which makes it harder for them to plan ahead.
One thing that is able to continue at this stage is construction. David Norman wants even more shovel-ready projects to be funded in Auckland, as does the Mayor, leaning on central government.
It helps with the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs, but just as importantly, it helps provide the infrastructure that Auckland desperately needs with the growth that it's had in the last 10 years. So what we're doing in stimulating the economy and creating jobs, we're also providing long-term assets for future generations.
The latest iteration of the wage subsidy is set to run for as long as Auckland's in Level 3 restrictions. However, David Norman is predicting unemployment in Auckland to reach around 8% by early 2021, twice as much as it was pre-COVID. But how that plays out is anyone's guess. For Checkpoint, call Jordan Bond, aho.
Some New Zealand Post courier customers can expect slight delivery delays after 2 workers at their East Tamaki Dispatch Centre tested positive for COVID-19. Both employees have since moved to managed quarantine, and their close work contacts have been in self-isolation awaiting test results, while all other employees at the site are being tested too. The centre has been deep cleaned and all workers are now wearing masks and are further spaced out. New Zealand Post CEO Mark Stewart says that means things are moving a little bit slower.
Over the last few days, we've had 2 confirmed cases at Auckland Operations Centre in Highbrook in Auckland. We've reviewed the video footage and they don't appear to have come in with prolonged close contact with each other over that period. So it's unclear yet at this stage whether this was a transmission in the wider community. And as I said, there's no evidence at this stage it was within our site, but that is still to be confirmed.
That's interesting. Do they socialise together outside of work, these people?
I'm not actually aware of that, but obviously, this may be too. The Ministry of Health would confirm whether this was the same cluster, full stop, and if so, how they contracted it separately. We don't know the answer to that.
Can you just explain at the operation there? Is it a sorting room? What is it? How closely do people work together? How many people would you have in that same space?
Yeah, so this is a big warehouse operation. It's roughly the same size of 6 football fields, high ceilings, very good ventilation with big transport doors at most sides of the building. We would have roughly 300 people working there across the 24/7 operation, so typically no more than 100, 120 at one time. And as a result, an individual would typically only work closely with a small number of other people on each shift.
So this infection, we believe, has happened during the Level 3 lockdown, has it?
That would be a question for the Ministry of Health and the medical experts. We don't have that information. Certainly I don't have that information to hand.
Okay, let me put it another way. Were your workers, are they always working 1 metre apart from each other currently?
So So as soon as the government changed the level 3 notice, we moved immediately to 1 metre separation and face masks. Following Ministry of Health guidance, we've actually moved to 2 metres at the site until we get all our people COVID tested, which is happening at the site over the next 24 hours. So no, those were all in place as per the Ministry of Health and government alert level guidance.
So when did you move to the 2 metres apart? Was that after you got the positive tests?
Yes, it was. Really importantly, though, both cases, we're really proud of how our team members handled themselves. None of them were working when they were symptomatic. They both felt ill out of work with initially mild symptoms and immediately did the right thing, contacted the manager, didn't turn up to work and got themselves tested. So, look, a great example for all of us to stay away the second you feel any sign of sickness.
So is every single person at that worksite now being tested?
They are being tested over the next 24 hours. It's happening as we speak and will be completed tomorrow, and we're expecting the results back with urgency after that.
And do you have close contacts or employees who are having to stay at home right now at the moment? We have determined for both the cases who are the close contacts who are working for a prolonged period with the 2 people who have been contracted the virus. Of the first case, there were 3 people in that situation. Those 3 people stayed at home immediately and have thankfully come back negative from their COVID test. In the second case, there are an additional 3 people, and we're awaiting the results of their COVID testing. They are still at home and will remain at home until a period after their test comes back negative. So do you have any concerns about, transfer on surfaces of parcels or mail?
So firstly, both from our medical advice, but also the medical advice of the global postal community, there's no evidence that we can find that suggests a heightened risk of transmission across mail or parcels. So no, we don't believe so, and we would be doing things differently if that was the case. And we are tapping into global insights there as well as our own medical expertise.
So given that you're now, spacing further apart, people are wearing masks in that work environment, what does it mean for the job you do every day? Is the mail going to be a little bit slower?
Oh, look, firstly, in terms of letter services, there's no impact to delivery of your letter to your letterbox, so no impact there at all. That's a different facility. In terms of our courier service, typically that gets delivered very reliably overnight. That will have an extra day added to it in Auckland for the next period, and the reason for that is because of basically the loss of productivity from moving from 1 metre separation to 2 metre separation.
So, Mark, I've got to ask you, given that we're in strange times, it's a pandemic, a virus, what advice are you giving people about whether they're still, licking envelopes and things?
Firstly, I think as people, it's right to be it's rightful to be a little bit anxious. I mean, we had a fantastic period where COVID was out of our community, and now it's back in. So we're just like anyone else in the community, our people and ourselves are feeling a little bit anxious about things. I think that the advice would be to listen to the experts, I guess, and both in terms of the lack of transmission from mail or parcels, that is the medical advice, and also the safe operation of all our sites across Auckland and New Zealand to ensure that we're following the right medical guidelines and in doing so, doing things in a safe way.
But would you rather people used a cloth or something rather than just licking it these days?
No. As I said, there's no evidence. I mean, people can take their own decisions in mind in terms of what they do, but no, that's not the medical advice we've been given. So no, that is not a requirement that we're requesting of the public.
And that's the New Zealand Post CEO, Mark Stewart. It is almost 22 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The Attorney-General says a High Court ruling that the country's Level 4 lockdown was unlawful for 9 days validates what it did in the early stages of the lockdown. Lawyer Andrew Borrowdale had argued that the Director-General of Health went beyond his powers when he put the country into full lockdown in March. The High Court has ruled from March the 26th to April the 3rd, the requirement for people to stay in their bubbles was justified but unlawful. However, it says a new order introduced on April the 3rd corrected that. David Parker told reporters the ruling means the government doesn't need to take any further action.
Got no plan to pass validating legislation. We don't think it's necessary. The orders are all fine. The effects on businesses, of course, were in respect of the early order, which closed down all business premises other than essential services.
So would there be any practical response or implications as a result of this judgment?
No.
I think that was just the same question I was going to ask, but are there any consequences to this finding?
No, we don't think so. We think that it's good that the Crown's won all of, from our perspective, the most important points.
Legally?
Well, the judgment also says that it was appropriate that specific legislation in response to COVID was passed as was, and they note that approvingly in the judgment. What we were trying to do during those early days was to take the people with us, really, from a point where there were very few restrictions to, in little over a week, having completely going from a point of very few restrictions on the 25th of March to a little over a week later having very broad restrictions on businesses and how people live their lives. The court said that the language that was used by different representatives of the government was effectively directive and should have been backed up by a written order to stay at home.
And that's the Attorney-General David Parker there. Much of the country has had a good dumping of rainfall today. Severe weather warnings were in place for Northland and Auckland as strong gales and rain lashed the regions. Annika Smith has more.
Over the past 24 hours, Kirikiri has received more than 60 millimetres of rainfall, Whangarei 35 millimetres and Auckland's North Shore 30 millimetres. A low-pressure system has hounded the upper North Island and is now making its way south down the east coast. NIWA meteorologist Chris Brandolino says any rainfall in Auckland is good news.
We certainly want the rain to occur over the dams here in the Auckland region. The drought is over with, we should mention that. So there's really no more drought per se, but oftentimes the effects of a drought can linger several months on.
Aucklanders are still being urged to conserve water as the region slowly inches away from a water crisis. Since before the first lockdown, its reservoirs have hovered in the low 40s for the first time since the 1994 drought. Today they sit at 61% full, which is still well behind the historical average for this time of year of 88% full. Federated Farmers Auckland President Alan Cole says farmers in the region are recovering well, bar a few patches. He's noticed fresh green grass on his own land as recently as this morning.
We've had extremely good growth early winter through to now. Still quite dry for this time of year. So I've had about 12 mils in the last 24 hours, which is a lot less than was predicted.
However, Mr Cole says lots of rain after the winter period isn't generally needed anyway.
We don't actually want rain in August, generally, but the underfoot's quite firm for this time. Well, no, it's actually extremely firm underfoot here on my farm here. So it's just, really quite unusual. We are having I don't know what my rainfall for the month is, but it'll be well below average again.
While Auckland farms are holding out okay after the drought, things aren't so rosy further south. Federated Farmers Hawke's Bay President Jim Galloway is wrangling a bull from a nearby paddock when he picks up the phone this afternoon. He says the east coast has been dry for a long time, and this recent weather front hasn't delivered what was promised yet.
We might have had half a mil or a mil of just nice drizzle, light stuff, which would be good for a start. As long as we can get some more solid stuff later on, this would be perfect because it's quite warm as well, which is just what we need.
June was one of the first times Hawke's Bay has received above average rainfall in the past 18 months. Mr Galloway says the dry spell persists, but farmers, with financial support from local and central government, are managing okay.
There's not a lot of water in the ground. It's good on top. It's growing reasonable grass for most of us. Still, some people are behind from catching up from the drought. So people are still recovering, and there is a lot less stock around. So there is that issue as well.
Mr Galloway says he expects more rainfall in the region into the evening, and he's in luck. NIWA's forecast has a separate second low moving just off the east coast now. For Checkpoint, this is Annika Smith.
A growing number of cruise liners have moored off the south coast of England as the entire industry grounds to a complete halt. And with luxurious overseas holiday spots off the cards for many, the ships have become an unlikely attraction for those forced to have staycations. The BBC's Duncan Kennedy reports.
Weymouth Bay has become a parking bay for Britain's cruise industry. We counted 10 ships today, giant, gleaming, empty vessels. They're here so they don't have to pay the berthing fees in ports. But these mega ships have now become major attractions.
Something else to come and see, isn't it? Something different.
There should be out cruising, but what can you do with this going on? I mean, it's a bit of a risk for the passengers, isn't it?
John Holland has been on 14 cruises in the past few years and can't bear to see them idle.
Most of them I've been on. Most ones, but it's a tragedy, isn't it? It really is. It'll be about 2-3 years before we get back on them.
The ships have become so popular, special boat trips are taking people round them in what's become a kind of maritime museum. Each vessel still has about 100 crew on board to keep them maintained and stop them drifting in rough weather.
To see ships bobbing around Weymouth Harbour is quite unprecedented. So the focus now moves on to how we find solutions. The cruise industry is a £10 billion industry for the UK, so it's vital it gets going.
This line of liners are currently the pride of Britain's cruising fleet, but it's currently a fleet, an industry off course.
That's Duncan Kennedy reporting. And some feedback before we go on Air New Zealand's testing regime. Only those coming back from America, the crews, are isolated for 48 hours. This person says, I'm absolutely horrified by Greg Foran's confidence. Testing of international crew coming from the USA is insane, only doing that. How hard is it to have all staff working in 2-week shifts in which they're isolated in home ports, then stand down once cleared? There is an abundance of staff to utilise. On the other side of the coin, my friend's husband is an Air New Zealand pilot. This listener says, I can tell you both of them take their safety and the safety of friends and family very seriously, and both follow the rules to the letter. I would be very surprised if any Air New Zealand staff don't do this. Thanks for joining us. Check out all our stories online. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Officials are retesting some nurses as they try to work out how a maintenance worker at Auckland's Ridges Hotel ended up with COVID-19. The Attorney-General says no charges which were laid are affected by a High Court judgment declaring the first 9 days of March's lockdown as illegal. Another 500 Defence Force staff will be deployed at isolation and quarantine facilities. Joe Biden has been officially confirmed as the US Democratic presidential candidate at the party's convention. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Rebecca Kittle from Victoria University on how parks and public spaces helped get us through the last lockdown and how they might help us get through the current one. We're giving away the 2020 Children's Book of the Year in this week's Hump Quiz, and technology-willing yachty Alan Forrest sailing the Kiwi Dream